A racist manager made fun of an older black janitor in the bathroom, without knowing that someone else was quietly sitting in one of the stalls. What happened next will shock you. At 68, Margaret Johnson, a janitor at Hartwell Industries, slowly pushed her cleaning cart down a long hallway. For more than 40 years, she had worked here, quietly keeping the company running, though few ever noticed her. To most, she was invisible, only appearing when something needed cleaning. But Margaret had no idea that today would be different. An unexpected encounter was about to turn her routine upside down, revealing the darker side of corporate life. This moment of humiliation would spark a change that no one saw coming. As Margaret walked to the executive offices, her thoughts drifted to her grandchildren. Each step felt heavier. After losing her daughter 2 years ago, she had to support her 3 grandchildren alone. Every ache in her body reminded her why she couldn't stop working, even though her doctor advised her to rest. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," a gentle voice said, pulling her from her thoughts. Margaret looked up to see Harry Anderson, a young accountant, smiling. Unlike most people, Harry always greeted her. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she replied kindly, despite feeling tired. "How are you today?" "I'm well, thank you. And you? How are the grandkids?" A rare smile crossed Margaret's face, easing her fatigue. "They're growing fast and keeping me busy." Harry nodded, genuinely interested. "I'm sure they appreciate all you do. You're an inspiration, Mrs. Johnson." Before she could respond, a harsh voice interrupted. "Anderson, don't you have work instead of chatting with the help?" Richard Blackwell, the department manager, approached, sneering at Margaret and glaring at Harry. Harry straightened up, his friendly tone gone. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. I was just heading to my desk." As Harry hurried away, Richard turned to Margaret. "And you, make sure you clean properly today. I'm tired of seeing dust in the corners." Margaret looked down and softly replied, "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I'll do my best." "Best?" Richard mocked, then walked off, leaving her alone in the hallway. She took a deep breath, trying to brush off his hurtful words. This wasn't the first time Richard had treated her like that, and it wouldn't be the last. As she returned to her work, Margaret thought about how much had changed over the years. When she started at Hartwell, it felt like home. Her co-workers were kind, and management valued her hard work. But as the older staff retired and new people arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Richard Blackwell was the face of that change. He had quickly risen through the company, pushing down anyone he saw as below him. To Richard, Margaret was just a nuisance, a reminder of the past. What Margaret didn't know was that her quiet strength in facing Richard's cruelty had not gone unnoticed. For months, Harry Anderson had been watching how Richard treated her. Each time he witnessed it, anger and guilt mixed inside him. Harry had joined Hartwell right out of college, hoping to succeed. He learned quickly to keep his head down to avoid Richard's attention. Richard was known for bullying, especially employees from minority backgrounds, and everyone knew to stay away from him. As Harry sat at his desk, he couldn't shake the image of Margaret's face when Richard insulted her. He had seen Richard humiliate her many times, and each time it became harder to stay silent. But fear of losing his job kept him quiet. "I wish I had the guts to say something," Harry thought, staring at his computer. But what would it change? Richard is too powerful. He'd just find a way to get rid of me. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his corner office, feeling satisfied. At 45, he believed he had reached the top and enjoyed controlling others. His drive for power came from years of feeling inadequate, and he made sure to assert his authority whenever he could. Richard watched Margaret through his office's glass walls. Seeing her bent over scrubbing the floor fueled his disdain. To him, she represented everything he looked down on. Older workers, the working class, and minorities he thought were holding the company back. "Time to put her in her place," Richard muttered, getting up from his chair. He walked toward the restrooms where Margaret was cleaning, feeling a familiar thrill. He enjoyed moments like this when he could assert his power without consequence. But he had no idea this encounter would lead to something much bigger. Margaret was on her knees scrubbing the bathroom floor when she heard the door open. The sound of expensive shoes made her heart sink. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Well, well," Richard's voice dripped with contempt. "Look who it is. Tell me, Johnson, do you even clean, or do you just pretend to work?" Margaret slowly stood, her joints aching. She kept her eyes down on the mop. "I'm doing my best, Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly. Richard stepped closer, the strong scent of his cologne mixing with the cleaning chemicals. "Your best? This is what you call your best? I've seen cleaner bathrooms at gas stations." His words stung, reminding her how little he thought of her. Margaret's hands shook as she gripped the mop tighter, trying to stay steady. "You know, Johnson," Richard continued with a cruel smirk, "I've been wondering, how does it feel to be so outdated? You're past your prime, and let's be honest, the only reason you're still here is nobody else wants this job." Margaret felt a lump in her throat, her eyes stinging with tears. She had faced Richard's harsh words before, but not like this. Each sentence felt designed to break her spirit. "I've been with this company for over 40 years, Mr. Blackwell," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I take pride in my work." Richard laughed coldly, his voice echoing in the bathroom. "Pride? In what? Mopping floors? You're just a leftover from a time that's long gone. We keep you here out of pity, but you can't even keep up anymore." Harry, who had quietly entered the restroom a few minutes before Richard, sat in a stall, frozen. He hadn't meant to overhear, but now he found himself listening to Richard's cruel words. His heart raced as he saw Margaret through the crack in the stall door, her shoulders shaking under Richard's insults. Richard stepped even closer, his voice filled with venom. "You know what your problem is, Johnson? You're too dumb or stubborn to realize you're not wanted here. People like you don't belong in a place like this." The ugly undertone of Richard's words hit Harry hard, filling him with disgust. He wanted to jump out and confront Richard, to stand up for Margaret, but fear held him back. What if he lost his job? What if speaking up ruined his career? The risks swirled in his mind, keeping him frozen in place. Margaret, her voice shaking, tried once more to defend herself. "Mr. Blackwell, I've always done my work to the best of my ability. No one has ever complained about what I do." Richard's eyes narrowed, and his voice became harsher. "Your ability? Let me be clear. Your best was never good enough, and never will be. You're a disgrace to this company, and seeing you reminds me how much dead weight we still have to get rid of." After Richard left the bathroom, his harsh words hung in the air. Thinking she was alone, Margaret couldn't hold it together anymore. She leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor, quietly crying. From his hiding spot in the stall, Harry listened to her sobs, feeling guilty. Each tear Margaret shed made him feel worse for staying silent. He wanted to step out and tell her she didn't deserve this, but fear kept him in his seat. Eventually, Margaret's crying faded. Harry heard her moving around, followed by the squeak of the mop bucket and the soft click of the door as she left. Only then did he step out, hands shaking and face pale. He stared into the mirror, barely recognizing himself. He felt small and ashamed for not speaking up. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the heavy guilt. Harry stared at his reflection, guilt weighing on him. "I should have said something," he muttered. "I should have stood up to Richard. What kind of person just stays quiet?" Deep down, he knew tomorrow would likely be the same. He'd pass Margaret in the halls, offer a smile or kind word, but do nothing to change her situation. The thought left him feeling empty. As he left the bathroom, Harry promised himself he'd be kinder to Margaret, showing her that not everyone treated her like Richard did. It wasn't much, but it was all he could manage. What Harry didn't realize was that this moment was just the beginning. In the coming days, his conscience would be tested, and he'd have to face the consequences of his silence. The workplace at Hartwell Industries was about to change, revealing hidden injustices. As the days went by, Harry couldn't stop noticing Margaret. He saw how she shrank when Richard was nearby, and how her once steady hands trembled as she worked. The guilt stayed with him, reminding him of his inaction. Harry began to find ways to make Margaret's day easier. He greeted her warmly every morning and sometimes left a cup of coffee on her cart with a note of thanks. He encouraged his co-workers to keep their desks clean. "Let's try to keep our areas neat," he suggested one day. "It'll help Mrs. Johnson." Some colleagues agreed, while others shrugged it off. But Harry didn't give up, hoping these small gestures could make up for his failure to stand up for her. Margaret noticed the change in Harry's attitude and saw a slight shift in how some employees treated her. It didn't erase Richard's cruelty, but it provided some comfort during her long days. One evening, as Margaret was finishing her shift, she was surprised to see Harry waiting by her cart. "Mrs. Johnson," he said gently, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you do. I know it's not always easy, but your work doesn't go unnoticed." Margaret's eyes filled with tears at his kind words. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." As Harry watched her walk away, he felt warmth, but also guilt. He was glad to have brightened her day, but Richard's cruel words still haunted him. He knew he should be doing more. Meanwhile, Richard continued his harsh treatment of Margaret and other minority employees. His cruelty seemed to worsen, as if he sensed the small acts of kindness and wanted to push back harder. Other employees noticed too. Quiet conversations began to spread, with people sharing stories of Richard's behavior and wondering how to support each other. But fear kept most of them from taking real action, as Richard's power in the company seemed too strong to challenge. As the weeks went by, tension in the office grew. Even with small acts of kindness, Margaret was struggling. The stress from Richard's bullying, along with her exhaustion and worry for her grandchildren, was wearing her down. One morning, as she pushed her cart down the hallway, she felt dizzy. The bright lights were too harsh, and the noise felt overwhelming. She stopped and leaned against the wall to catch her breath. While Margaret was trying to steady herself, Harry walked by with papers in his hands. Noticing her discomfort, he quickly approached. "Mrs. Johnson, are you okay?" he asked, worried in his voice. Margaret tried to nod, but before she could answer, everything went dark. Harry watched in shock as she collapsed. He dropped his papers and rushed to her side. "Help! Somebody call an ambulance!" Harry shouted urgently. People gathered around, some trying to help, while others just stood by. Richard Blackwell appeared, irritated by the noise. "What's going on here?" he barked as he pushed through the crowd. When he saw Margaret on the floor, he barely hid his contempt. "Really? She can't even stay on her feet," Richard muttered. "This is why we need younger people around here." Harry, checking Margaret's pulse, looked up at Richard, shocked by his lack of concern. "She needs help, Mr. Blackwell. This is serious," he said firmly. Richard sighed, clearly uninterested. "Fine, call an ambulance. But don't expect her back until she's ready to work. This isn't a charity." Harry sat at his desk, lost in thought as news of Margaret's collapse spread through the office. Whispers filled the hallways as employees exchanged worried looks and speculated about her health. Concern for Margaret mixed with worries about their own jobs, especially after hearing how Richard had reacted. As the witness to Margaret's collapse, Harry became the focus of many questions. Colleagues came to his desk, asking for updates on her condition and sharing their frustrations about the office. Though Harry answered their questions, he felt angry at Richard for his lack of care and guilty for not speaking up. The weight of his silence grew heavier as the day went on, leaving him feeling helpless. Did Blackwell really just stand there and do nothing? A co-worker asked during lunch. Harry nodded, his face serious. He cared more about work than Mrs. Johnson's health. Another colleague shook her head in frustration. That's just like him. Someone has to stand up to him. But how? Harry replied. He has connections with the board. Anyone who speaks up risks losing their job. The group fell silent, each person feeling powerless. They shared the same frustration, but no one had an answer. As the days passed with no news about Margaret, the initial shock wore off. The office returned to its usual routine, but Harry felt different. Every time he walked past Margaret's unused cleaning cart in the supply closet, he was reminded of his guilt. One late evening, Harry struggled to focus on his reports. His thoughts kept drifting back to the day he failed to act. He replayed it in his mind, feeling the guilt weigh on him, making it hard to sleep or concentrate. Just as he was about to leave, he overheard a conversation from the break room. "Did you hear about the new CEO?" a voice asked. Harry recognized Sarah from Human Resources and edged closer to listen. "New CEO?" replied Tom from Marketing. "Yeah, Harrison is replacing Jennings, who's retiring." Harry felt mixed emotions. A new CEO could mean changes, maybe even a better work environment. But what if this new leader was just like Richard? The news spread quickly, but Harry remained quiet, unsure what to think. Change was coming, but after years of Richard's cruelty, he found it hard to believe things would improve. He tried to ignore the rumors in the office. People whispered about what Mr. Harrison would be like. Some thought he would cut costs, while others hoped he would make positive changes. Meanwhile, Richard's behavior worsened. He stomped through the office, barking orders and dismissing any talk of the new CEO. It was clear he didn't want to lose control. For Harry, uncertainty filled the days ahead. He hoped the new CEO would bring justice for Margaret and others like her. But he knew real change would only happen if someone stood up to Richard. Harry entered the office that morning feeling uneasy. The buzz about the new CEO had been constant, but no one knew what kind of leader Mr. Harrison would be. He noticed the tense energy in the air, with colleagues exchanging nervous glances. Around mid-morning, he heard Richard's loud voice from his office. "I'm not worried. No one's going to change how I run things, CEO or not." Harry felt a knot in his stomach. Richard's confidence was unsettling. It was clear the new leader wouldn't change his behavior. As hours passed, the office buzzed with speculation, but there was still no sign of the new CEO. By lunchtime, everyone wondered why Mr. Harrison hadn't introduced himself. On his way back from getting coffee, Harry nearly bumped into a man he didn't recognize. The man looked out of place in casual clothes, unlike the usual suits. "Sorry about that," Harry said, stepping aside. The man smiled. "No worries. Do you know where Richard Blackwell's office is?" Harry pointed down the hall. "It's the last door on the right. You can't miss it. It's the biggest office." "Thanks," the man said. "I'm new here. Is there anything I should know about Mr. Blackwell?" Harry hesitated, unsure whether to warn him. What if this guy was a friend of Richard's? "Mr. Blackwell is very results-driven," Harry replied carefully. "He likes to keep things running smoothly." The man nodded. "Got it. Thanks for the heads up." "Harry Anderson, by the way," he said, shaking the man's hand. "Good to meet you, Harry," the man replied. "I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon." Harry returned to his desk, thinking about the brief encounter. Something felt off, and he was frustrated for not saying more. A few minutes later, loud shouting erupted from Richard's office, grabbing everyone's attention. Richard's angry voice was impossible to ignore. "Who do you think you are?" Richard yelled. "Coming in here dressed like that? I'm not taking orders from some low-level diversity hire." The entire office fell silent, all eyes on the closed door. Harry felt his heart race. Richard could be tough, but he had never heard him go this far. Suddenly, the door flew open, and the man Harry had just met walked out. He looked calm, but there was a sharp, determined look in his eyes. Behind him, Richard stormed out, his face flushed with anger. As soon as the man spoke, his voice cut through the silence in the office. "I think it's time for a company-wide meeting. Right now," he said firmly. Harry's stomach dropped as it all clicked. This wasn't just a new employee. His suspicions were confirmed when the man continued. "I'm Michael Harrison, your new CEO, and it seems there are serious issues we need to address." The news spread shock throughout the room. Employees glanced at one another, some barely able to hide their amusement at Richard's stunned expression. Richard looked like he had been struck by lightning. Mr. Harrison's face grew serious as he seemed to realize the weight of what had just happened. He turned to the rest of the office. "Everyone, meet in the main conference room in 5 minutes. It's time to have a real conversation about this company's culture." People quickly began moving, and Harry felt a whirlwind of emotions. Relief that Richard's behavior had finally been called out, nervousness about what this could mean for the company, and guilt for not speaking up earlier. In the conference room, the mood was tense as employees quietly filed in. Richard entered last, slipping to the back of the room, keeping his distance from Mr. Harrison. Harrison, still in his casual clothes, waited patiently at the front, a stark contrast to the crowd of business suits. Once everyone settled, he began. "I had planned to spend my first day observing, getting a sense of how things work here," he said, his tone firm but calm. "But from what I've seen in just a few hours, it's clear we've got a lot of work ahead of us." He looked around the room, his eyes meeting each employee's. "I believe in a workplace where every person is respected, no matter their role or background. What I saw today is far from that standard." Richard shifted uneasily, but said nothing. Mr. Harrison's voice remained steady as he addressed the room. "Let me make one thing clear," he said. "Under my leadership, discrimination, harassment, and any kind of abusive behavior will not be allowed. This company is about to go through big changes, and I need everyone here to get on board." A ripple of reactions moved through the room. Some employees looked relieved, while others seemed uneasy. Harry couldn't help but hold his breath, hardly believing what was unfolding. "I understand that change isn't easy," Mr. Harrison continued, "but it's necessary. Starting tomorrow, we'll be putting new policies in place to make sure this becomes a safe and respectful workplace for everyone." He paused, his tone softening a bit. "If anyone here has faced or witnessed any inappropriate behavior, I want you to know my door is open. Your concerns will be listened to and taken seriously." As the meeting wrapped up and people began to leave, Harry felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Mr. Harrison standing beside him. "Your name's Harry, right?" Mr. Harrison asked. "Can we talk privately for a moment?" Harry, feeling uneasy, nodded and followed him into a small office. Once inside, Mr. Harrison's tone softened. "Harry, I noticed your reaction earlier when I mentioned witnessing some inappropriate behavior," he said calmly. "Is there something you'd like to share with me?" Harry paused, torn between the fear that had kept him silent for years and the growing urge to speak up. He thought about Margaret and all the times he hadn't said anything, and finally made up his mind. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "There is something I need to tell you. It's long overdue." For the next hour, Harry revealed everything he had seen and heard. He told Mr. Harrison about Richard's mistreatment of Margaret and other minority staff, the incident in the bathroom, and Margaret's breakdown. As he spoke, the weight he had been carrying seemed to lift. Mr. Harrison listened closely, his face serious. When Harry finished, Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "Thank you, Harry," he finally said. "I know that wasn't easy, but you did the right thing, and now I can take the necessary steps to address this." Harry took a deep breath, feeling both nervous and relieved. "What's going to happen now?" he asked. Mr. Harrison looked determined. "Now, we make things right. For Margaret, for you, and for everyone who's been hurt by this toxic environment. It won't be quick or easy, but I promise, things will change." As Harry walked out of the room, he looked at the office differently. The fear that had always held him back was still there, but now it was mixed with hope. For the first time in a long while, he felt like things might actually improve. In the following weeks, Hartwell Industries began to change. Mr. Harrison quickly put new rules and procedures in place. Richard Blackwell was suspended while a full investigation took place, and the company launched a training program focused on diversity and inclusion. The biggest change for Harry happened when he and Mr. Harrison visited Margaret in the hospital. Mr. Harrison had insisted on going himself and asked Harry to join him. Walking into the sterile hospital room, Harry felt a knot in his chest when he saw how weak Margaret looked lying in the bed. But when she saw them, her face brightened, and it was like the years melted away. "Mrs. Johnson," Mr. Harrison began, sitting down beside her. "I'm Michael Harrison, the new CEO of Hartwell Industries, and I believe you already know Harry." Margaret gave a nod, her eyes filled with curiosity. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Harrison. And Harry, it's really good to see you." Mr. Harrison leaned in, speaking sincerely. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm here to apologize on behalf of the company. The way you've been treated is completely wrong, and I want you to know that we're committed to making things better." Mr. Harrison began explaining the changes happening at the company, like a thorough review of everyone's working conditions and pay. But what he said next made Margaret tear up. "We want to offer you early retirement," he said softly, "with full benefits and a pension to make sure you and your grandchildren are well taken care of. It's the least we can do after everything you've been through." Margaret's hand shook as she held Mr. Harrison's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." As Harry and Mr. Harrison left the hospital, Harry felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. "Thanks for doing that," Harry said. "It means a lot, not just to Margaret, but to all of us who've worked with her." Mr. Harrison nodded, deep in thought. "It's just the beginning," he replied. "There's still a lot to fix, but this is a step in the right direction." Mr. Harrison looked at Harry, a small smile on his face. "Actually, Harry, I have a proposal for you. How would you feel about leading our new employee relations department? We need someone who knows the problems we've faced and isn't afraid to speak up when things aren't right." Harry was caught off guard. "Me? But I stayed quiet for so long. I didn't speak up when I should have." "You did when it mattered," Mr. Harrison replied. "That shows courage, Harry. The kind of courage we need to bring real change." As Harry thought it over, he realized this was his chance to make a real impact, to ensure that no one else at the company would go through what Margaret did. "I'd be honored," he said at last, his voice steady with new confidence. Harry felt Mr. Harrison clap him on the shoulder. "Great. We've got a lot of work ahead, but I believe we're going to turn Hartwell Industries into a place where everyone can succeed." As they headed back to the car, Harry felt something new, a sense of purpose. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt prepared to face whatever challenges came next. Over the following months, Hartwell Industries began to change in a big way. With Mr. Harrison's leadership and Harry's focus on improving employee relations, the toxic culture that had existed under Richard's management started to fade. The company began to shift toward respect and inclusivity. After a thorough investigation, Richard Blackwell was fired. The evidence, including Harry's testimony and statements from other employees, was undeniable. His removal made it clear that discrimination would no longer be accepted at the company. Harry threw himself into his new role, working hard to put new policies in place, lead training programs, and most importantly, ensure that employees felt comfortable sharing their concerns. Under his leadership, the Employee Relations Department became a key part of Hartwell's transformation. One of the first things Harry did was start a mentorship program to connect new employees with experienced ones. The goal was to create a supportive community within the company and help those just beginning their careers. He was thrilled when Margaret agreed to be an advisor for the program, sharing her knowledge and experience even in retirement. The changes at Hartwell Industries grabbed attention in the business world. News about the company's focus on fairness and equality spread quickly, attracting talented people from diverse backgrounds. This brought fresh ideas, leading to innovation and higher productivity, which improved profits. For Harry, the best part was seeing his co-workers change. The fear and hopelessness that once filled the office were gone, replaced by hope and engagement. People smiled more, collaborated easily, and seemed genuinely happy to come to work. One afternoon, about 6 months after Mr. Harrison became CEO, Harry was surprised to see Margaret. She looked healthier and happier than he had seen her in years. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, standing up with a smile, "it's great to see you. How have you been?" "I'm doing wonderfully, Harry. Or should I say Mr. Anderson, Head of Employee Relations?" Margaret replied, her eyes sparkling. Harry laughed. "Just call me Harry, Mrs. Johnson. You've known me too long for that." "All right, you can call me Margaret," she said, looking around his office with approval. "You've done well for yourself, Harry. But more importantly, you've helped others. I've heard about all the changes you're making here." Harry felt proud. "We still have a lot to do, but we're making progress. How's retirement treating you?" "It's been a blessing, Harry. I can spend time with my grandchildren without worrying about money. And this mentorship program you started, it's given me a new purpose. I never thought I could use my experiences to help others, but that's exactly what's happening." As they continued their conversation, Harry reflected on how much had changed. Margaret, once broken by the company's toxic culture, was now thriving and playing a key role in its transformation. He, who had once been too scared to speak up, was now leading efforts to improve the company. Their chat was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mr. Harrison stepped in, smiling when he saw Margaret. "I thought I recognized that voice," he said. "Margaret, it's great to see you. I hope you're not trying to convince Harry to retire." Margaret laughed. "Not at all, Mr. Harrison. I was just telling Harry how impressed I am with the changes around here. You've created something special." Mr. Harrison smiled. "We've all made this happen. Everyone who spoke up and embraced the changes is part of this. And Margaret, your strength inspired more people than you realize." Harry felt grateful. He remembered the day he was too afraid to stand up for Margaret, and how different things might have been if he had acted sooner. But he focused on the future, a future where every employee felt valued. Before Margaret left, she paused at the door and looked back at Harry. "I always believed you could do great things, Harry. I'm glad you finally believe it too." With that, she walked out, leaving Harry determined to keep pushing forward. Later that evening, as he packed up to leave, he glanced across the office. The desks and computers were the same, but the atmosphere had changed. People were chatting and laughing, making the workplace feel more like a community. Harry reflected on the progress they had made, but he knew there was still more to do. Building a truly inclusive workplace was an ongoing effort. New challenges and biases would always arise. But as he watched his colleagues, he felt they were on the right track, and he was committed to staying the course. As he turned off the office lights, Harry made a promise to himself, to Margaret, and to every employee at Hartwell Industries. He would never let fear silence him again, always stand up for what was right, and work tirelessly to ensure that everyone had a chance to thrive. Harry left the office that evening with a smile, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The story of Hartwell Industries' transformation was still unfolding, but each day added to a growing sense of hope. The company became an example of what could happen when people stood up for what was right. Hartwell Industries shone as a symbol of change, reminding everyone that bravery and kindness could reform even the toughest systems. The journey had been long and challenging, but for Harry, Margaret, Mr. Harrison, and every employee who found their voice, it was worth it. They changed not just a company, but lives, writing a new chapter in the fight for workplace equality and human dignity. As Hartwell's transformation became known, other companies began to take notice. Industry magazines featured the story, highlighting how employee satisfaction and productivity had soared. Mr. Harrison and Harry were invited to speak at events, sharing insights on creating an inclusive workplace. Their work didn't just impact Hartwell, it inspired businesses everywhere to rethink their practices and reignite the conversation around workplace fairness and diversity. Looking back, Harry marveled at how far they had come. He remembered the moment in the bathroom when he chose not to speak up and the regret that followed. He learned an important lesson. It's never too late to stand up for what's right, and one act of courage can inspire others. As time passed, Hartwell Industries continued to grow. The company was no longer known just for its products. It became a symbol of fairness and opportunity. People from various backgrounds wanted to work there, drawn by its reputation for valuing everyone. Even in retirement, Margaret remained a key figure at Hartwell. Her story became part of the company's history, reminding everyone of their journey and the importance of equality. The mentorship program she helped with continued to thrive, guiding new leaders who embraced respect and inclusion, ensuring Hartwell's commitment to a better workplace stayed strong. 5 years after the transformation, Harry settled into his role, greeting every employee he passed. He believed that in a workplace where everyone mattered, small gestures of respect went a long way. One afternoon, Harry received an email from an intern named Aisha asking for a meeting. Curious, he agreed. When Aisha arrived, he noticed the mix of nerves and determination in her expression. "Mr. Anderson," she began, "I wanted to thank you for what you've done for this company. My grandmother used to work here." Harry felt a flicker of recognition. "Your grandmother?" "Yes," Aisha replied, smiling. "Margaret Johnson was my grandmother." A wave of emotion washed over Harry. "I had no idea." "She encouraged me to apply," Aisha said. "She told me about all the changes, about you and Mr. Harrison, and how Hartwell had finally become the place she always hoped it would be." Feeling moved, Harry said, "Your grandmother was an amazing woman. We owe her a lot." Aisha smiled. "She thought very highly of you, Mr. Anderson. She said you were the one who finally stood up and told the truth about what was happening here. That's why I wanted to meet with you." Taking a deep breath, she continued, "I've noticed some things in my department. Nothing as serious as what my grandmother faced, but there are attitudes and comments that make me uncomfortable." Harry listened as Aisha explained her concerns. While the issues weren't major, they included subtle biases and microaggressions that could create a negative environment over time. After she finished, Harry nodded seriously. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Aisha. You did the right thing by speaking up. We will address these issues right away." He paused, then added, "Your grandmother would be proud of you. It takes bravery to speak out." Tears filled Aisha's eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. That means a lot to me." Once Aisha left, Harry leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. Margaret's influence remained strong, not just through policies, but in the bravery she passed down to her granddaughter. It reminded Harry that their work truly made a difference in people's lives. The next day, Harry gathered the marketing department leaders for a meeting. He didn't mention Aisha, but brought up the concerns she expressed and introduced a plan for better training and accountability. As he explained the changes, he noticed mixed reactions. Some looked uncomfortable, while others nodded, but everyone listened carefully. "Some of you might think these are small problems," Harry began, "but it's the small things that set the tone for our workplace. Every comment and action shapes our environment, and we must ensure it's one of respect and inclusion for all." In the following weeks, Harry worked closely with the marketing team to implement changes. He checked in with Aisha often to ensure she felt supported. As more people heard how things were handled, Harry noticed a quiet change in the office. People became more aware of their behavior and spoke up more when they noticed something wrong. It wasn't always smooth. Problems still arose, and sometimes there was tension or disagreement. But each time they faced these issues directly, the company grew stronger in its commitment to respect and equality. One evening, just as Harry was about to leave, he received a call from Mr. Harrison. "Harry," Mr. Harrison said warmly, "I just heard some great news. The National Association for Workplace Equality has recognized us. They want to give Hartwell their award for commitment to diversity and inclusion." Harry felt proud. "That's amazing, sir. It shows everyone's hard work." "It certainly does," Mr. Harrison replied. "I'd like you to accept the award for the company. This wouldn't have happened without your effort and leadership." After ending the call, Harry felt a wave of emotions. He thought about Margaret, Aisha, and all the employees who found their voices over the years. He remembered the long path they had walked together, from fear and silence to openness and respect. Winning the award was a great recognition, but Harry knew the real success was in the everyday life of Hartwell Industries. It was in seeing employees smile because they felt valued. It was in lively discussions, "We're different." With a content smile, Harry switched off his office light and left for home. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges and new chances to make a difference, and he felt ready, carrying the lessons from the past with hope for the future. As he walked through the parking lot, he remembered something Margaret had said to him before she retired. "Change doesn't happen all at once, Harry. It happens slowly, day by day, person by person. We just have to keep pushing forward, doing the right thing, and trust that it matters." Her words had stuck with him, guiding him through hard times and reminding him to celebrate the victories. Now, with Hartwell on the edge of national recognition for their efforts, Harry knew Margaret was right. They had transformed the company one day and one person at a time, changing not only Hartwell, but lives, including his own. As Harry drove home that evening, he couldn't help but feel thankful. He was thankful for the second chance to make things right. He appreciated leaders like Mr. Harrison, who had the vision and courage to push for real change. He was also thankful for people like Margaret and Aisha, whose strength in tough times had inspired so many. More than anything, though, Harry felt grateful for being part of something bigger than himself. He was proud to contribute to a movement that was slowly changing corporate America. He was helping to build a world where everyone, no matter their background or role, could come to work feeling valued, respected, and empowered to reach their full potential. As he pulled into his driveway, Harry reminded himself to call Margaret the next day to tell her about the award. He knew she would be proud, not just of the recognition, but of how far they had come together. Hartwell's journey was far from over. There would be new challenges ahead, but Harry felt ready. Now more than ever, he knew that one person's actions could make a real difference, and that speaking up, even when it was hard, could spark changes that reached far beyond the walls of one company. As Harry fell asleep that night, he felt a calmness settle over him. Once a quiet observer, he had become a strong advocate for change. He knew that each day ahead, he would keep standing up for what was right. He would speak up for those who couldn't, and he would keep working to build a world where stories like Margaret's were left in the past. True leadership, he realized, wasn't about holding a title or having power. It was about having the courage to do the right thing, the compassion to care for others, and the dedication to create a better world for everyone. At that moment, Harry understood his true purpose. He wasn't just an executive, he was a force for change, a voice for equality, and a source of hope for those who dreamed of a fairer, more inclusive world. The journey of Hartwell Industries, of Margaret, Harry, and everyone who had found their voice along the way, would inspire others for years to come. It would stand as proof that no matter how strong injustice may seem, change is always possible. With courage, persistence, and a focus on what's right. A world where everyone can thrive is within reach. As a new day began at Hartwell Industries, the company had become a powerful example of what could be achieved when people worked together for equality and respect. The road had been long and sometimes hard, but for everyone involved, every step had been worth it. In the end, they hadn't just transformed a company, they had touched lives. By doing so, they have added a new chapter to the story of human dignity and justice in the workplace. With the sun rising on another day, Hartwell Industries stood prepared for whatever challenges might come, united by their dedication to building a better world, one day, one person at a time. And perhaps that was their greatest success. Thank you for watching. What do you think of this remarkable story? Let us know in the comment. Thanks for being part of the journey.